As we begin to look at the book of Exodus, I felt it was important to remind ourselves of the story so far. My first instinct was to show the whole of Joseph and his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, but sadly, time doesn't allow. Instead, Yvonne is going to come and read us the last part, the final part of Genesis, the story so far.
After burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, together with his brothers and all the others who had gone with him to bury his father. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph, saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of your servants of the God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph stayed in Egypt along with his father's family. He lived 110 years and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children, also the children of Micaiah, son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
And now Roger is going to read the first chapter of Exodus as the story continues.
Good morning. Our second reading is from Exodus chapter 1, verses 6 to 22. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. "Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and, if war breaks out, will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar, and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, "When you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live." The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do, and they let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?" The midwives answered Pharaoh, "Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive." So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
So, a new and exciting series in Exodus. And today I'm going to introduce some of the key themes that we'll encounter as we journey through the opening chapters. But as I said, we need to kind of look a little bit at the story so far. The events of Joseph's life, very much thanks to Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice, are probably some of the best known in the Bible. The spoilt great-grandson of Abraham, who was sold into slavery by his jealous brothers, but was rescued by God and enabled by God's gifts of knowledge and foresight to help Egypt through a terrible famine. The boy went from rejected prisoner to second in command in the Egyptian empire and sang a lot of well-known songs along the way. And as Genesis ends, as Yvonne read to us, all Joseph's family were reunited in Egypt. The Egyptian people welcomed them with open arms, and they all lived happily ever after. Except a few hundred years later, Exodus opens with a very different picture. The Israelites were numerous and flourishing, but then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power. Too much time had passed. Too many people had tried to describe that photo. Memories had been lost and blurred. Over time, maybe the Egyptian rulers preferred not to remember that they were saved by a foreigner. Maybe the story got a little bit embellished to make Pharaoh look good. And eventually, Joseph and his God-enabled rescuing were forgotten. And suddenly, the welcomed friends and family of their hero Joseph became an overabundant nuisance and a threat to the Egyptian people. And in that, the first theme of Exodus is introduced: remember. The Egyptians hadn't remembered Joseph. But as we travel through Exodus, we'll see again and again the importance to God's people of remembering what God had done. And I think it stands as a directive to us too, to remember what God has done in our own lives. Remember the answered prayers, the opportunities, the blessings. It's too easy when times are good to think, I'm doing fine, look what I'm achieving. Look how well I'm doing, and to forget God's blessings. And then when the harder times come, suddenly God seems further away, remote, maybe even uninterested, and we forget to ask or choose not to ask for help and struggle and battle on our own, unwilling or unable to ask God for help. Remembering what God has done is vital to keep us humble and thankful in good times and faithful and dependent in more difficult times. And that's true for us as individuals, and I think it's true for us as a church as well. Not living in the past, but remembering to enable us to move forward. So remembering will be a key theme. As the chapter went on, we saw how quickly forgetting led the Egyptians to fear and mistrust, and then eventually led them to back-breaking slavery, vicious oppression, and eventually attempted genocide. It's such a bleak picture, isn't it? But as I've read it this week, I've realized that it's also feels like a scarily modern picture. Mistrust, misunderstanding, fear of someone different, leading to oppression and violence. So the emotions and the trajectory of the Egyptian people is clearly explained in that first chapter of Exodus. But Exodus is the book that tells us the story of God rescuing his people. It's the foretaste of God's ultimate rescue of those who believe through Jesus. It's the story that foreshadows our own redemption. So where were God's people at the beginning of Exodus? And where was God? Well, the first chapter doesn't actually tell us much about the Israelites and how they were responding to the oppression from the Egyptians. Were they crying out to God for help? Or had they given up on God and assumed he didn't care or was powerless to help them in their terrible situation? We're not told about all the people, but we are told about the two midwives, commanded by the terrifying Egyptians to kill the Hebrew boys. But instead, they remained faithful to God and obeyed God and disobeyed the king. And at this point, it's worth noting that in the whole of Exodus, no Egyptian king or official is given a name. And yet here, we learn the names of the two humble and faithful midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. Their names are important because they're important. And their names mean beauty and splendor. So here we're introduced to the next key theme of Exodus, identity. Who we are in relationship with God. Our names in God's book. The Egyptian kings aren't named, but the faithful, God-fearing midwives are given names and identities because they knew and feared God. And fearing God here isn't the same as fearing the horrible Egyptians. To fear God is to know him, to understand who he is, and to hold him in awe. The midwives feared God. They knew him, they were in awe of him, and they were secure in their relationship with him. And as they trusted him and their identity in him, they were secure enough to find God-given courage to refuse the might of Egypt's king. And in return, they received the God-given blessing of family, the most precious gift of all. So man's identity in relationship with God will be another central theme. Now, I'm guessing we don't often read passages of Scripture that barely mention God at all. But Exodus 1 doesn't really mention God very much. It's setting a scene, and God's only mentioned a couple of times. But even within those couple of mentions, another key theme emerges. Who is God? Through Genesis, we've seen God dealing with individuals. And in Exodus, we will see God in relation to his people. The unchanging character and nature of God will be revealed to his people and ultimately revealed to us. What is God like? Well, Exodus chapter 1 tells us that in the midst of oppression and terror and death, God is awe-inspiring, faith and courage-inducing, and kind. Which is a pretty good start in revealing God's nature. There are two other themes that we'll follow throughout Exodus, which are only just touched on in this first chapter. The first is worship. At the heart of the relationship between God and his people is worship, literally worth-ship. Just as the God-fearing midwives did, knowing, understanding, acknowledging and proclaiming God's character and worth. And much of Exodus will concentrate on how and why God's people are to worship God. And I passionately believe that worship in all its forms should be at the heart of all that we do as a church and as individuals, giving our very best to acknowledge and proclaim the greatness of God. That well-known work, the Westminster Shorter Catechism, which was completed in 1647 and is still a tome that you should return to many times, it states, "A man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever." A man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. Exodus will teach us that. They understood that in 1647, and we can still hold that true today. Or as Jesus put it, worship God in spirit and in truth. So remember, identity, who is God, and worship. And there is one more theme that we will see through Exodus. And it, of course, reminds me of the question posed in a Sunday school class long ago. The teacher asked, "What's brown and furry with a fluffy tail and eats nuts?" And the bright little boy at the front of the class shot up his hand. "The answer must be Jesus, but it sounds like a squirrel." The answer must always be Jesus. And again, we have a hint at this theme in the last verse of the chapter. "Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people, every boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile." Did it sound familiar? We heard it just a couple of weeks ago, didn't we, from the directive from Herod to kill all the boys in his attempt to get rid of the infant Jesus. At every turn in the story of Exodus, God's promised Messiah is foreshadowed and anticipated. And I'd go so far as to say that without understanding God's redemption of his people in Exodus, we'll not fully understand God's redemption through his Son and the price that Jesus paid to earn that redemption for us. So, I hope you're excited about Exodus, the amazing story of God's redemption of his people, which teaches us to remember, to understand our identity in God, to know and worship who God is, and will point us to Jesus. But we're going to return to remember. As I said, remembering what God has done in our lives is vital to keep us humble and thankful in good times and faithful and dependent in more difficult times for us as individuals and as a church. So I'm going to invite us all to take a moment now to remember. Maybe at the moment things are tough, and remembering God's faithfulness and blessings in the past may give you the encouragement and the strength to move forward in faith. And maybe things are good, in which case it's right just to remember and say thank you. We'll have a few minutes quiet, and then I'll invite us to say part of Psalm 77 as a prayerful response to God's command to remember. But let's just take some time in the quiet to remember. Let's say together these words from Psalm 77. I will cry out to God for help. I will cry out to God to hear me. I will think about the former days, the years of long ago. I will remember my songs in the night. My heart will meditate and my spirit will ask, will the Lord reject forever? Will he never show his favor again? To this I will appeal, the years when the Most High stretched out his right hand. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I will consider all your works and meditate on all your mighty deeds. Your ways, God, are holy. What God is as great as our God? You are the God who performs miracles. You display your power among the peoples. With your mighty arm, you redeemed your people. I will cry out to God for help. I will cry out to God to hear me. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. And as we continue to remember and respond, the music group are going to lead us in a beautiful song of prayer. More love, more power.
More love, more power, more of you in my life. More love, more power, more of you in my life. And I will worship you with all of my heart. And I will worship you with all of my mind. And I will worship you with all of my strength. For you are my Lord. More love, more power, more of you in my life. More love, more power, more of you in my life. And I will seek your face with all of my heart. I will seek your face with all of my mind. I will seek your face with all of my strength. For you are my Lord. You are my Lord. I will worship you with all of my heart. I will worship you with all of my mind. I will worship you with all of my strength, for you are my Lord. You are my Lord.